Section 35 of the treasure chest of my book house. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Treasure Chest of My Book House, edited by Olive Beaupre Miller. The Boy of Cadore, by Catherine Dunlop Cather. The boy's eyes were dark, and they gazed wistfully after the horseman who was dashing along the white highway. "Think of it, Catarina!" he exclaimed. "He rides to the wonderful city!" Catarina looked at her brother as if she did not understand. There were many towns along the road that ribboned away to the south, each of which seemed large indeed to the mountain girl, yet she had never thought of them as wonderful. "The wonderful city?" she repeated. "Where is that, Tiziano?" "Why, don't you know?" he asked in surprise, as if it could be other than Venice, the great city of St. Mark. But the name did not thrill black-eyed Catarina. Older than her brother and far less of a dreamer, she had heard that dreadful things happened in the city, and that sometimes people went hungry there. In the mountains there was food enough and to spare, and though no one was rich and lived in a palace with tapestried walls and gorgeous furnishings, neither were there any very poor. So she shrugged her shoulders and replied, "Oh, Venice! I don't know why you call that wonderful. There are no mountains there, nor meadows where wild flowers grow. Are you tired of the Dolomites, Tiziano?" "Ah, no," came the earnest reply. "But artists live in the city, and I could go there. I might study with Bellini and paint some of the things that are in my heart." Catarina was just a practical village girl who thought that if one had enough to eat and wear, he ought to be satisfied. So her voice was chiding and a bit impatient as she answered, "You talk so much about painting and seeing things no one else sees. And the villagers say unless you get over your dreaming ways, you will grow up to be of no account. That is why father thinks of apprenticing you to Luigi the cobbler, for he can teach you his trade, which would be far better than always thinking about Venice. For, Tiziano, there are other things in the world beside painting." Tiziano shook his head but did not reply. Nothing else mattered half so much to him, and many a night, when the rest of the family were sleeping, he lay in his bed wondering how he could persuade his father to let him go away to study. It was well known that he spent many hours drawing on boards, stones, and anything he could find, and that the village priest, the good padrone, had praised his work. But little was thought of that. Other youths of Cadore had sketched as well and amounted to nothing, so why should he be sent to the city just because he could copy a mountain or a bit of woodland? For he could not make them understand that color was what seemed to burn in his soul, because that he could not express in his charcoal. A whistle came from down the road, and Catarina saw her brother Francesco beckoning them to hurry. "They must be ready to begin weaving the garlands," she exclaimed. So they broke into a run towards the village inn. It was the glowing, fragrant June time of the Italian highlands, when the hillsides and meadows of the fertile Dolomite valleys were masses of many-colored bloom, and next day the festival of flowers was to take place. They had spent the afternoon blossom hunting, and now, when sunset was crimsoning the peaks, were homeward bound with their spoils to aid in preparing for the revelry. In a few minutes they joined the other young people at the inn and began making garlands and planning games and frolics as they worked. Pieve di Cadore was very far from the world in those days of little travel, and when the time of a festival was at hand, the villagers were as light-hearted as the gay Venetians at carnival time. Songs and merry jests went around. "Have you heard that Salvator, the miller's son, is going to Venice to study the art of carving?" asked a girl whose tongue kept pace with her hands. "Since his father has become rich, he has given up the idea of having him follow his own trade, and thinks it more elegant to become a sculptor." Sebastiano, whose uncle was a lawyer's clerk in Bergamo, and who knew more of city ways than the other village youths, remarked, I didn't know he had the love of carving. It takes something beside a rich father to make an artist." The talkative girl tossed her head. "That may be," she retorted, "but no money, no masters, and without them, pray, how can one do anything?" "So I tell Tiziano when he talks about going to the city to study painting," Catarina broke in. "Father is not rich, and it would be better for him to think of learning cobbling with Luigi." Peals of laughter followed the announcement, and someone called out, "Tiziano! Why, he hasn't had even a drawing master. He builds the tower of his castle before the foundation." Tiziano's face turned red. He had no teacher, it was true, but he believed he could prove he was worth one if given a chance. "Oh, if I only had some paints," he thought, "maybe they would stop calling me a dreamer, for I am sure I could make a picture, and then perhaps I could go." But pigments were rare and costly, and though his father was a well-to-do mountaineer, he had no gold to waste in buying colors for a lad who had never been taught to use them. The next morning the boy noticed stains on the stone walk made by flowers crushed there the day before. They were bright and fresh as if painted, and it put an idea into his head. He did not speak of it, however, although it was on his mind so much that when the gaily decked villagers danced on the green, he did not see them. But as soon as a chance came, he crept from the revellers and went out into the meadows. Catarina saw him go, and wondered what took him from the merriment. Her curiosity was greater than her desire for fun, so she followed, and overtook him just as he reached a hillside aglow with blossoms. "What are you doing, Tiziano?" she called. The boy looked up as if doubtful whether to tell her or not, but he knew his sister loved him even though she did criticize his dreaming, and that she would keep his secret. "I am going to paint a picture," he answered. For a minute she stood and stared. Then, thinking he was teasing, she retorted, "Of course you are, without any paints." But his earnest face told he was not joking. "I shall use blossoms," he continued, with a wonderful light in his eyes. "See, all the colors are here, and I have found that they will stain. I saw where they did it on the stone walk." Catarina was not a dreamer like her brother, and never saw pictures where others found only a bit of color. But she believed that what he proposed to do was not impossible, for she too had noticed the stains on the stone. And she began to think that he must be a very bright lad, for no ordinary one could have thought of it, and that perhaps his wanting to go to Venice was not a wild idea after all. She had heard the padrone say that no undertaking that fills the heart is impossible to one who has patience and courage and persistence, and that help always comes to those who try to help themselves. So she decided to help Tiziano, even though it was only in the keeping of his secret and the gathering of materials for the work. So into the fragrant patches they went and began collecting blossoms of every hue, reds, pinks, blues, and purples such as sunset painted on the mountains, and warm yellows and lavenders that the boy saw in the pictures of his fancy. Then they hurried to an old stone house that stood on land owned by their father. It was a vacant house, seldom visited by the family, and never by the villagers, and there, where he could be safe from molestations, he was to paint the picture that they hoped would be the means of taking him to Venice. Catarina wanted to stay and watch the work, but Tiziano objected. "I don't want even you to see it until it is finished, because at first it will not seem like a picture." So she went away and left him outlining with a bit of charcoal on the wall. For many days afterwards, whenever he could steal away without being noticed, he worked with his flower paints. Catarina went over the meadows on feet that seemed to be winged, always watching that none of the villagers saw her put the blossoms in at the window near which her brother worked. So while each petal made only a tiny stain, and the boy painted with the rapidity of one inspired, he not once needed to stop for materials. Little by little, the picture grew beneath the magic of his touch, and he and Catarina kept the secret well, Only the flocks pasturing on the fragrant uplands went near the deserted house, so no one knew that a boy was at work there who was destined to win a glory for Italy. Little did the villagers dream, as Caterina skipped over the meadows, that the blossoms she gathered were being put to an immortal use. One evening, when the sun was dipping behind the peaks and the merry voices of shepherds homeward bound with their flocks sounded down from the heights, Tiziano stepped to the door of the house and called to his sister outside. "It is finished, Caterina, and it is the very best that I can do." She went dancing in, filled with joy that the task was done. But when she stood in front of the picture, the merriment went out of her face, and she spoke in tones of reverence. "Oh, Tiziano, a Madonna!" "Yes," he agreed, "a Madonna and Child, with a boy like me offering a gift. It is what was in my heart, Caterina." For some minutes she stood there, forgetting everything else in the beauty of the fresco. Then, thinking of what it would mean to her brother when the villagers knew he had done such a wonderful thing, she started out to spread the news. "Come and see," she called to Luigi the cobbler, as she hurried past the door where he was sorting his leather. "Tiziano has painted a Madonna on the walls of the old stone house." Word travels fast when it goes by the tongue of villagers, and soon a group of folk moved toward the building where the lad waited. His father, coming down from a day's hunting in the mountains, saw them go and followed, wondering what was the matter. But by the time he reached the place, such a crowd had gathered that he could not see the fresco. Murmurs of "How did he do it? Where did he get his paints?" rose on all sides, and everyone was so excited that the father could not find out why they were there. Then he heard Tiziano's voice. "I did it with flowers from the hillsides. Caterina gathered them while I worked." Exclamations of amazement followed, and the good padrona spoke reverently. "With the juices of flowers? Il divino Tiziano!" Antonio Picelli looked about him as if dazed, for he could not believe what he heard. "Am I mad?" he asked a villager who was standing close by. "Or did the padrone call my Tiziano the divine?" "No," came the answer, "you are not mad." And when they told the story, and the crowd stepped back that he might see, he too thought it a wonderful thing. Whether or not Salvatore, the miller's son, went to the city to study sculpture, no one knows. But Tiziano did go, and the Boy of Cadore became the marvel of Venice. There, guided by the master hand of Bellini, he began plying the brushes that were busy for almost 80 years, painting pictures whose glorious coloring has never been equaled, and proving to the mountain folk that it isn't bad, after all, to be a dreamer, where dreams combined with work do marvelous things. And if the father, who thought he had gone mad when the village priest spoke his boy's name as reverently as he could a saint's, could come again today to the Valley of Flowers in the Italian highlands, he would hear the self-same words that were used that twilight time in speaking of his lad. "Ecco," the villagers say, as they point to the noble statue that looks out toward the meadows in which Caterina gathered blossoms. "Il divino Tiziano." See, the divine Titian. And by that name the world knows him to this very day. Venice, as the music of Galuppi brings it to mind, by Robert Browning. Here you come with your old music, and here's all the good it brings. What, they live once thus at Venice, where the merchants were the kings, where the St. Mark's is, where the dogs used to wed the sea with rings. Ay, because the sea's the street there, and 'tis arc by what you call Shylock's Bridge, with houses on it where they kept the carnival. I was never out of England, it's as if I saw it all. End of section 35.